She helped to organize a union for teaching assistants at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, and now sings in the community and works as a music teacher. She will sing the classic tune about economic servitude, 16 tons. I owe my soul to the company store. So go ahead, Emily.
All right. Hello. Thank you all, comrades. I hope it's been a fabulous day. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't be here in Toronto. You know, work is how it is. But I do hope you'll enjoy. I've been busy this week, so I hope you'll forgive any mistakes I make in my piano playing today. Some people say a man is made out of mud, a poor man made out of muscle and blood. Oh, muscle and blood and skin and bones, a mind that's weak and a back that's strong. You load a 16 tons, what do you get? Oh, another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. I was born one morning when the sun didn't shine. I picked up my shovel, I walked to the mine. I loaded 16 tons of number 9 coal. A high straw man said, oh, bless my soul, you load 16 tons, what do you get? Oh, another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. I was born one morning, it was drizzling rain. Fighting and trouble are my middle name. I was raised in a canebrake by an old mama line. No high-toned woman made me walk the line. You load a 16 tons, what do you get? Oh, another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. If you see me coming, better step aside. Oh, a lot of men didn't, a lot of men died. Oh, one fist of iron and the other of steel. The right don't get you, then the left one will. You load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, I can't go. To the company store.
Woo-hoo. Thank you so much. Thank you, comrade. Okay, so now we'll get into our first speaker, who is Comrade Yazin Kaya, a longtime member of Socialist Action, is a public sector worker based in Ottawa and a member of the Canadian Association of Professionals Employees, CAPE, the third largest federal public service union in Canada with 24,000 members. He writes on diverse political matters encompassing international economy and eco-socialism. He is also the managing editor of the Red Review, a monthly online journal of Socialist Action. Welcome, Yazin.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Let me begin by expressing my wish to be in Toronto with most of you. For years, I relished being at OISE with you for the Significant Educational Conference, formerly known as the Trotsky School, with the primary goal of educating revolutionaries and sparking fruitful discussions among our cadre. Additionally, I want to start with an apology. I've been grappling with a challenging flu, and I still cough occasionally, so I may need to mute myself during the presentation for cough breaks. My presentation today has dual purpose. First, It will serve as an educational goal. It will serve an educational goal by introducing the foundational elements of Marxist economics. This involves providing insights into the inherent dynamics of capitalism, emphasizing how the system, capitalist system, systematically generates economic inequalities and instabilities. Secondly, my presentation will take on a more exploratory and open-ended nature. It will extend an invitation to contemplate together and develop a Marxist theory of inflation. This aspect not only will encourage you, the audience, to absorb established Marxist concepts, but also it will prompt all of us, revolutionaries, supporters of socialist action, to contribute to the evolution of Marxist economic thought, specifically in the context of understanding inflation. So my presentation has 4 parts. I will begin with providing the context within which we present this panel. And following that, I will delve into 2 Marxist theories, the labor theory of value and the tendency of profits to decline, the rate of profit to decline. The final segment will focus on the Marxist theory of inflation. Okay, let me start with the context. The timing of this panel is noteworthy because there's a growing dissatisfaction with neoclassical orthodox economics. This orthodoxy tends to oversimplify matters into equations of market balance, supply and demand, and the like. It is also timely because there's a growing alternative discourse. It is also a variant of mainstream economics, and it is gaining prominence. This discourse challenges the statistical and mathematical focus of neoclassical economics and directing attention toward other dimensions of social relations, including the ethical realm. This perspective seeks to elucidate economic circumstances by examining moral failures or human behavior such as greed. However, our objective is to highlight systematic factors, such as the profit motive, which is intrinsic to capitalism. And this profit motive is also give rise to human characteristics such as greed, which is often falsely attributed to human nature. In this sense, I think, social relations shape what we refer to as human nature. This panel is timely not only due to this dissatisfaction with mainstream economic theories, but also there's a current upward trend in inflation. The inflation rates in the prices of goods and services in major capitalist economies has been on a declining trajectory since 1980s, but this trend persists despite central banks' efforts to boost the money supply, printing money, aiming to stimulate demand and achieve specific inflation targets. However, in the recent years, especially after COVID, there has been a recent shift in this pattern, with inflation becoming a tangible reality affecting our day-to-day lives. For workers, excuse me, this reversal is particularly concerning. For us, this is particularly concerning because us workers and our families are understandably uneasy about prices in shops, in utilities, and other services, and the prices are rising faster than wages and benefits. In general, higher inflation translates into reduced spending power for us, leading to diminished aggregate demand for goods and services. This in turn puts the brakes on economic growth, which causes more unemployment, which is bad for us. Okay, after this contextual note, this is the context that we're presenting this panel. After this contextual note, and before delving into the explanation of labor theory of value, let me start with 2 methodological notes, Marxist methodological notes. First, according to Marx and Marxists, social phenomena exist and can only be comprehended within their historical context. This is very important. Like transhistorical generalizations, like attributing inflation solely to greedy human nature, are deemed invalid. Human societies exhibit diverse organizational structures across time and space. For Marx, The distinguishing factor lies in the mode of production, whether capitalist or feudal, which in turn intricately linked to class relations. Very similarly, this is an important point too, the concepts employed to grasp societal dynamics should mirror the organizational framework dictated by the mode of production. So when we're discussing value and price, we refer to their specific characteristics as they manifest under the capitalist mode of production. So in the rest of the presentation, when I say value and price, uh, I mean value and price in the context of capitalism, in this particular mode of production, so that our concepts mirror, or the concepts developed by Marx, value and price, they mirror the mode of production he aimed to understand with these concepts. Also, Marx identifies concepts and levels of analysis based on the degree of concreteness, complexity, and specificity of the subject matter. For instance, the concepts that are used to explain historical shifts between modes of production, like from shifts from feudalism to capitalism, these concepts differ from those addressing specific dynamics within capitalism, such as particular economic crisis in specific countries. As the level of abstraction changes, as the level of concreteness, complexity, specificity changes, so do the concepts. This is important to understand too. This is also important to understand when we're discussing Marxist theories. So, in addressing contemporary inflationary dynamics, Marx's theory of capitalist relations of production remains crucial, I think. But it might not be sufficient to capture the intricacies. Perhaps we need new concepts to understand these new dynamics, new concreteness, and these concepts should be tethered to present day realities. So this implies that perhaps Marx, who wrote in the late 19th century, mid and late 19th century, cannot be the sole reference for Marxists. Other political economists, like Ernest Mandel, can contribute to enriching our understanding and crafting new explanations. Okay, now the labor theory of value. First, let's delve into the concept of the mode of production as Marx posited it as the distinguishing factor among the societies. The fundamental question here is how societies produce material conditions for their own production. Let me repeat this. The fundamental question here is how societies produce the material conditions for their own production. All societies generate use values to fulfill their needs. This is an imperative for their continuous existence. These use values span essentials like food to intangibles such as health and education. Within every society, there exists a division of labor to manufacture these use values. However, it's important to note that not all use values function as commodities. Sunshine, for instance, is a use value freely available, not subject to purchase yet. Occasionally, friends contribute to use values without an exchange. Comrade Julius once helped me to paint my wall. Use value without the market. And commodities, on the other hand, they always encapsulate exchange value. That's why Marx's analysis in Capital begins with the examination of commodities. Commodities for Marx are like akin to the atoms or the cells of capitalist societies, the most basic structure of capitalism. Commodities are. They're not merely economic phenomena, by the way, because they're important to understand the fundamentals of our social existence. For Marx, commodities are use values produced by labor for exchange. In simpler terms, every commodity is exchanged through money, connecting the concrete labor of individuals. Consider the intricate web of exchange relationships in the market. In this complexity, the labor of a public service worker like myself relates to the labor of a worker in China. So the relationship between commodities connect us. So it's not merely an economic phenomena, but a very complex social phenomena in that sense. But then the question arises, what allows them, the commodities, to be equivalent in exchange? It's not their physical qualities, weight, size, or color. Otherwise, a small piece of diamond would command a similar price to a piece of coal. But obviously, a diamond is more valuable than coal. The labor theory of value posits that it's a socially necessary labor time, not the individual capacity or skills, socially necessary labor time that determines the value of commodities. The Marxist says socially necessary labor time refers to the amount of time required to produce a commodity under exchange. Let me repeat, let me correct myself. In Marxist sense, socially necessary labor time refers to the amount of time required to produce a commodity under average conditions of production, taking into account the prevailing skill level and technological standards in a given society. So we're talking about not an individual skill level, but also an average in that particular time and in that particular level of productivity. So it's crucial to clarify that this doesn't imply the price of a commodity aligns with its value or the social necessary time to produce it. This is, I think, important. Various factors, such as monopolies, scarcities, and supply and dynamics, contribute to determining the price. What I'm trying to say is, today, when you look at the price of something, it does not necessarily correspond to the social necessary labor time or its value. There is a gap because price is also determined by other factors like monopoly, scarcity, supply, demand dynamics, so on and so forth. But focusing on price rather than value doesn't explain the fundamental flaws that are consistently leading to crises and inequalities of capitalism. They're almost like accidental. They're not essential. Prices are not essential in capitalism. Values are essential. That's why Marx focuses on values. So to uncover the inherent qualities of capitalism, so Marx separated what is essential from what is not essential. This is an abstraction. He assumed that commodities are exchanged at their values. So this was an assumption Marx made. Commodities are exchanged at their values. This is very important for understanding the capitalist system. But if we maintain this assumption, we cannot understand prices. In other words, Marxist labor theory of value cannot be used or directly applied to understand the prices today. We can follow this logic and add and say Marxist theory of labor needs more thinking to understand the fluctuations in price and inflationary dynamics. So let's recap this section. In his seminal works, particularly in the first volume of Capital, Marx presents a theory of value, but it's not an explanation of price. While the labor theory of value is crucial for comprehending capitalism, it cannot be directly applied to elucidate the fluctuations in prices and understanding inflation. Now, the tendency of profits to decline, next part in my presentation. In this presentation, I will outline an inherent tendency in capitalism, often employed to understand the periodic and intrinsic economic crisis within the system. However, the reason for introducing this also serves another purpose. I want to demonstrate that inflation acts as a counter tendency for decline in profit rates, and it offers a temporary relief for the capitalist class as a whole. Capitalism, now I'm explaining the tendency of profit rates to decline. Capitalism expands by unleashing economic forces that compel every capital, and to some extent the workers, to behave in ways that facilitate the accumulation of capital as a whole. Despite this inherent internal coherence, capitalism is inherently flawed. The subordination of human needs to the profit motive leads to crises and contradictions constraining the scope of reproduction of capital. Marx characterized capitalists as a band of fighting brothers or warring brothers, locked in a perpetual struggle to outdo each other by producing commodities more cost effectively than their rivals. The capital they reinvest in production primarily goes into machines, which Marx referred to as dead labor. He categorized investment in production in two segments: The first involves raw materials, machines, and other goods used for commodity production, which possess fixed value. These constitute the constant capital invested by capitalists. The second form of investment is in labor. In this realm, capitalists have flexibility as they can drive down workers' wages, and they can fire workers. The labor that capitalists purchase is thus termed variable capital, not fixed capital, unfixed capital, variable capital. Capitalists can enhance output by investing in more of the same variable and constant capital, employing additional workers with an increased number of machines. However, a more efficient alternative involves making the factory more productive through new technology that reduces the time needed to produce commodities. Let me try to give you an example. I hope you can follow me here. For example, a capitalist manufacturing computers might invest $2,000 in employing workers and $2,000 in machines, yielding $2,000 of profit. If the workforce produces 40 computers a day, each computer embodies $50 of variable and $50 of constant capital, along with $50 of surplus value. Alternatively, the capitalist might opt for more extensive machinery consisting 4,000 in constant capitals, but capable of producing 100 computers a day. In this scenario, each computer now embodies only $20 of variable capital and $40 of constant capital. While it seems that both constant and variable capital have decreased in the second case, the ratio of variable to constant capital has changed, meaning workers are now tied to more machinery per worker. Marx termed this ratio, the ratio of machinery investment to labor, the organic composition of capital, which has a tendency to rise under capitalism. The initial capitalist investing in new machinery gains the profit advantage by undercutting others. However, as more capitalists adopt the new machines, this advantage diminishes. On the surface, this may appear beneficial, contributing to the mass production advanced at lower computer prices. However, commodities embody not only constant and variable capital, but also the surplus value extracted from workers. As we've seen in the computer example, investment in the workplace remains the same. Since profit stems from human labor, increased investment in machinery by multiple capitalists reduces the average labor time required to produce each commodity. This leads to falling rate of profit as the ratio of surplus value to investment decreases across the system. Let me repeat that last part. This leads to a falling rate of profit as the ratio of surplus value to investment decreases across the entire system. The great contradiction in capitalist production lies in the fact that the more a capitalist accumulates, the greater the problem for the capitalist system as a whole. Yet the logic of accumulation is central to the system. Capitalism not only wreaks havoc on the environment and the lives of those compelled to work within, but it also propels itself into even greater crisis. While this tendency is not an iron law, capitalists have strategies to counteract this falling profit rates, such as attacking workers' conditions, increasing the hours of the labor force without a proportional pay increase, so that they can boost the surplus value. They can boost capital surplus. They can eliminate breaks, implement supervision, so that capitalists gain efficiency, maximize machine utilization, so on and so forth. And most importantly, perhaps, wage cutting or keeping wages below profit, it can counter falling profit rates. In this sense, inflation can act as a counter tendency. In inflationary settings, wages may not increase as much as inflation, resulting in the decline in real wages. In this sense, this decline will lead to increased surplus value extraction, consequently boosting overall profits for capitalists, hence counteracting that fundamental tendency of rate of profit to decline. Okay, thus far, here's the summary of what I presented. I started with a brief overview of the Marxist methodology for analyzing social phenomena. Then I delved into labor theory of value, which is a foundational concept in Marxist framework. I emphasize that labor value is not necessarily a theory of price and cannot be directly applied to understand fluctuations in price and changes in the inflationary dynamic. Then I explored the tendency of profits to fall, which is a key element of the cited to understand inherent stability of capitalism. And I highlighted the point that inflation might serve as a counter tendency to that trend of uh, 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 I highlighted the point that inflation might serve as a counter tendency to the tendency of profits to fall. Now I'm transitioning to a more exploratory part of this presentation by asking whether the labor theory of value can be changed, used to develop a theory of inflation. It can't be directly used, but perhaps we can use it to um, uh, start or build a theory of inflation. This part is more exploratory. We're trying to explore. Um, One perspective that I liked so far is considering the inflation through a Marxist lens by exploring the works of Italian Marxist economist Guglielmo Carcedi. Carcedi, the last name is spelled as Carchedi. Carcedi. Also, Michael Roberts, I think he's from UK. He contributes to this effort through his insightful blog, The Next Recession, Michael Roberts. Here's the manner in which they construct their argument. I'll do my best to summarize their argument. I may repeat what I said earlier in explaining their argument. And I know that I have 10 minutes and I will make sure that I am done in 10 minutes. So as I said earlier, in capitalist production, there's a continuous effort to enhance labor productivity, aiming to produce more units per worker. However, this leads to a decrease in labor time per unit. Since it is labor that creates value, there's a general trend for the supply of goods and services to increase, accompanied by a corresponding tendency for the value of commodities to decline over the long term. This occurs because capitalist accumulation prioritizes labor saving processes, causing the value of commodities to decrease alongside the rise of labor productivity. Use values are produced in larger quantities than the value within them. So consequently, if prices of production hinge on value, there exists an inherent tendency for commodity prices to fall rather than rise as total value diminishes relative to total production over time. I'm still trying to summarize their argument. The demand for commodities hinges on the newly created value in production. This new value dictates the demand or purchasing power over the supply of commodities. The class struggle divides this new value into wages and profits. If the class struggle favors, if the capitalists are winning this class struggle, so this values, the share of profits is way more than share of wages in this instance. Or if the workers are winning, the wages will be the share of wages will be higher in this newly created value. So wages are allocated to purchase consumer goods, while profits are directed towards acquiring capital or investment goods. However, there is a tendency for new value to decline. This decline occurs first because the total value diminishes relative to the supply of commodities. And secondly, due to the increasing organic composition of capital, capitalist accumulation, being labor saving, leads to the value of machinery, plant, raw materials, etc., rising in comparison to the value of labor power. Since the price of production in value terms consists of constant capital, the new value, a growing organic composition of capital, will likely decrease the proportion of new value in the price of production. I hope I'm not getting too complex here, but I will summarize this in few words in a bit. Total value will decrease relative to the production of used values, and new value will diminish relative to total value. This creates an inherent disinflationary influence on commodity prices over the long term. The value of inflation, in Carcadi's sense, explains the slowdown in annual consumer price inflation since the 1980s. However, again, counteracting factors exist, and these factors can exert upward pressure on prices in the long term. Notably, these factors are intervention of monetary authorities, central banks, attempting to regulate the money supply. I remember after the crisis, quantitative easing, and basically we're talking about printing money or other forms of printing money without printing actual money, increasing money supply. Carcadi's idea about inflation is that there's a value rate of inflation. It considers how changes in the buying power of wages and profits interact with the money supply, measured as cash deposit in banks. The first factor has a stronger influence and usually brings down price inflation. The second factor tries to push inflation up, but doesn't usually succeed in doing so permanently. The value rate of inflation is calculated by adding the percentage of changes, wages, and in profits to the percentage change in the money supply. So when we look at the data from the US, because that's where the better data is, when looking at data from the US since 1960, we observed that the value rate of inflation tends to decrease over long term. This is because the combined purchasing power of wages and profits grows at a slower pace, and any adjustments in the money supply have not been enough to prevent slowing down of the value rate of inflation. And between 60s and 79, the value of rate of inflation rose, so that the inflation between 1980 and 2019, the value rate of inflation slowed, and so did inflation. More recently, especially after COVID, there has been an increase in the money supply. Additionally, there was a decrease in profits of about 25%, in wages about 20%, resulting in a significant decline in the combined purchasing power of new value. This is in the early days of COVID. Anyway, together, these factors created inflationary dynamics. However, the solution was to slow down the money supply by increasing interest rates. Yet, these monetary solutions did not effectively counteract the slowdown in the downward trend of profits and wages. So let me summarize. I'm wrapping up now. Marxist labor theory of value is fundamental to understanding how capitalism functions. Even though it isn't specifically crafted to explain changes in prices and inflation. Nevertheless, it can be adapted to formulate a labor theory of inflation. The inherent tendency in capitalism for the profit rate to decline finds partial counter tendency through inflationary dynamics that diminish real wages. This also illustrates that purely monetary policies, such as increasing interest rates, can limit the money supply and consequently slow down inflation. However, these measures would not reverse the trend of profitability crises that have marked capitalism's last 4 or 5 decades. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I look forward to elaborating on some of these points during the question and answer period following Radhika's presentation, which I cannot wait to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, okay. Our next speaker is Radhika Desai, is a professor, Department of Political Studies, and Director, Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg. She is the author of Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, 2013, and other books. She is a member of the Venezuela Peace Committee in Winnipeg and was featured on the September 2022 essay webcast, Is There a Magic Money Tree? Welcome back, Radhika.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I need permission to share my screen.
Okay, the technical producer will look after that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm still seeing, so who is the technical producer?
It's Kiri.
Yeah, Kiri.
Are you able to do that, Kiri? Yeah. Okay.
I think he's looking into it. Okay, he's able to do that, and let me now just choose it. Now, where is the screen that I should choose? Where did it go? Hang on, it's open. Okay, let me. Show all windows. Okay, there we are. Well, it is showing all windows. Sorry, just 1 second, please. I'm just going to have to close a few windows here. And then screen. Okay, here we go. All right. I hope everyone can see my screen. That should be the first one. Thank you, Yasin. Okay, so let's dive into this. Oh, can you still see it? Yeah. Okay, great. So let's dive into this. So I've changed the topic slightly. So I'm going to begin by explaining to you why I've changed the topic slightly. I'm not talking about greedflation, but I think in many ways Yasin has already dumped that. So in some sense, but nevertheless, let me talk about inflation in general, and I'm going to explain why that is, and then I will go on and explain some basics about what I think inflation is, what causes it, generally what is causing it now, etc. And very importantly, what it has to do with the dollar system. So this is also important. And I should also add as a preface that everything I'm going to say today is really based on my long-standing interest in Marxist theory. So I particularly appreciated Yasin's presentation. I think it's very important for us to return to Marx in many ways. But at the same time, I also am eclectic, and not eclectic, but let's say I also draw from Keynes insofar as I think that his thinking is totally compatible with Marx. And I've done a lot of work on money domestically, international money, or world money, both the sterling system and the dollar system. And Elizabeth earlier pointed out that one of my books is called Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. And that's the book in which I first put forward my analysis of both, of the world system, of the US role in it, and particularly the role of the dollar system. And then more recently, if you're interested in these ideas and what I have to say, I've also published a new book called Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, in which is available free for whoever just wants the PDF. So I thought I would mention that because much of this analysis is actually in there as well, and several other papers. So the title I've given the thing is Inflation and the Class War. So the first thing is, why did I substitute the word greedflation for inflation? So greedflation has become a buzzword, and if you go to X and simply search for tweets on greedflation, you will find there's a plethora of them, and practically every one of them says that there is something going on called greedflation. So one of them had a meme which is like this: stop saying inflation when what you really mean is record-breaking corporate profits and price gouging. The very famous economist Robert Reich, who was an advisor to President Clinton, indeed he was President Clinton's labor secretary, says if inflation comes up at the dinner table tonight, don't forget to draw attention to the deeper structural driver of inflation, the concentration of the American economy in the hands of a few corporate giants with the power to raise rates even as they make record profits. True, although I would say, of course, that many other economies with much less concentration are probably facing inflation as well. And of course, there was, and I'll come back to this point in a minute. So the problem with this thesis that this is the main cause. I'm not saying it is not a cause of inflation, but the idea that it's the main cause of inflation is what I'm contesting. Because the thing is that even the most important and reliable paper on inflation, which was written by Isabella Weber and Ivan Wasner, called Sellers' Inflation, Profits and Conflict, Why Can Large Firms Hike Prices in an Emergency? They don't just blame monopoly for inflation. If monopoly was to blame, then we would have had pretty consistent inflation throughout the neoliberal era, and indeed since the early 20th century, because that's what we've been in the phase of monopoly capitalism since that time. So monopoly comes into play, according to this paper by Weber and Wasner, only once cost increases have already increased along certain supply chains. So I think that's the basic reason why I've changed the topic. Now, of course, the fact that people are focusing on greedflation is also an important part of politics, because essentially the Democrats, the Biden Democrats, hope to get elected both to the presidency and to the House by essentially saying that they are going to do something to attack monopoly pricing, and they have tried to do a lot of, shall we say, they have made a lot of song and dance about how they are going to try to control the power of corporations. The problem with that, of course, is that their funding, and Biden is going to need more money than ever to get reelected, is actually reliant on the very same corporation. So we're not going to see much action. We're going to see a lot of talk on this front, but not very much action. So that is one of the part of the elements of politics around this, but there is also a more other elements. So in general, I would say that if you think about the politics of inflation, the class war or class struggle aspect of inflation, what one must bear in mind is that the battle between inflation and unemployment, that is to say, should the macroeconomic policy prioritize decreasing inflation or decreasing unemployment? Because both are ills, both are part of the so-called misery index. So the sum total of the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment is supposed to be the misery index. So both of them are part of so-called economic well-being. But this battle between inflation and unemployment is essentially a battle between the owners of labor and the owners of capital or money. Quite simply, in general, it is the case that capitalist growth can often be at least mildly inflationary. Particularly in modern times, it typically has been. Now, if you say that if you're on the side of labor, you will say, okay, we will tolerate mild inflation in order that we will have robust growth, in particular that we will have full employment. So if you are a partisan of labor, that's what you will say. But of course, if you're a partisan of capital, you will say absolutely no tolerance for inflation. Why? Because if I'm Madam Moneybags and I'm sitting on a lot of money and the rate of inflation is going, say, at 3% or 5%, my money is worth less every year by that percent. And that is something I'm not willing to tolerate, especially if I'm not able to find ways of making money with this capital, which can compensate for this rate of inflation and then give me positive rates of return. So that is a very general point that one must bear in mind. Now, this general point is become very complicated in our time. And I'm going to say this right at the start, and hopefully I will return to this at the very end. So today, this battle, so when people like Robert Reich and other partisans of the Democrats say that, we should not have punishing increases in interest rates, we should which will cause inflation and which will cause unemployment. I mean, they're absolutely right that is exactly what it does. But there's another question involved. Because at the moment, actually, the real danger that working people face from inflation is not that the Federal Reserve is going to go too far in dealing with inflation, but rather that it is going to do very little, because at the end of the day, working people are also affected adversely by inflation. So why will the Federal Reserve do too little? The reason for that is that for the last couple of decades, except for brief interludes, which I will point out to you in a minute, we have had in the United States, and my discourse will also be primarily focused on the United States, like Yaya's, because really that's where bulk of the debates are taking place, and that our own debates are derivative of those debates. So I'm going to focus on them. So the Federal Reserve has followed a policy of LIRP, LIRP, or ZIRP, ZIRP, low inflation rate policy or zero inflation rate policy. Plus, it has engaged in so-called quantitative easing, which means injecting more money into the economy, essentially by buying up less liquid assets. So, for example, if I hold, if I'm somebody who holds bonds which are sort of tied up for the next 20 years, then if the Federal Reserve advertises a program to buy these bonds, then what it's doing is it's taking away my bonds in which my money is locked up for the next 20 years and giving me cash for it, which means it is injecting liquidity into the economy. So these policies, ZIRP and QE, have created vast inflations over the last 2 decades, not of ordinary prices, except for small aberrations like after 2008, but it has created vast inflations of asset bubbles. So again, there are 2 types of inflation. One is ordinary inflation that affects the production of new goods and services, and the other is the vast inflation of asset bubbles that we have been living with for, well, actually for 20, 25 years, and even more if you look back to the dot-com bubble. Okay, so this has created, now, so we had the dot-com bubble that burst in 2000, then we had the housing and credit bubble, they burst in 2008, and now we have a so-called everything bubble, because over the last decade and more, since 2008, the Federal Reserve has injected so much liquidity into the system that it has led to the inflation of in the markets for practically every type of asset, whether you're looking at fancy paintings or stocks, bonds, real estate, you name it, everywhere there is a bubble. Now, these bubbles, or this everything bubble, changes the context. Yes, the Federal Reserve is attacking the situation, it claims, by raising interest rates. And yes, I totally agree that raising interest rates causes unemployment and economic pain for ordinary working people. But the real question to my mind is whether the Federal Reserve can afford to raise interest rates enough to stop inflation if raising interest rates means pricking the everything bubble. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at this chart of federal funds rate. Now, this peak here that you see, I hope everybody can see my cursor, right? Yeah, this peak that you see here is the Volcker shock. That is when Paul Volcker, in order to deal with the runaway inflation that the United States was witnessing in the 1970s and early 1980s, he basically tightened money supply so much. And he said, I'm just going to tighten money supply. I'm going to let interest rates do whatever they like. And what they liked to do was they touched nearly 20%. Some of you who are old enough will remember that. And then the interest, that induced a massive recession. You can see this thick line here, which is next thickest to the COVID pandemic recession here, which is shown in the darker shaded section. So that's the idea. But you see here that interest rate increases of just over 5%, about, I would say 6.5%, pricked the stock market bubble. Then they went down again, but then they came up to just a little over 5% and they pricked the housing and credit bubbles. Then they have, this is the bit that I'm talking about, this little bit here and this bit here of low and zero interest rate policies. The Feds tried to start raising interest rates again, but financial markets freaked out, so it lost nerve and it went back to a zero interest rate policy until the until the recent 2022 rises in interest rates. And today it has brought interest rates right back up to where it was in when it burst the the housing and credit bubbles here. So we are now at the danger point. We have already seen there is a crisis in commercial real estate. There's a crisis in many other markets, including, by the way, the treasury market. There is, we already saw the failure of several banks. And so we are, in some ways, you can say that you are already in the next crisis, although this one, it will unfold perhaps in a slow motion fashion. So given the danger of pricking the everything bubble, what we are more likely to see is a Federal Reserve unable to raise interest rates to the extent necessary to really deal with inflation, which means that basically the Federal Reserve will be caught between trying to choose between monetary stability, that is to say, bringing down inflation, or financial stability, not pricking this everything bubble. And I would say my bet is that it is not going to, it's done what it can by now. Now everybody and their dog is talking about either keeping them steady at where they are right now, or in fact, bringing them lower beginning sometime next year. Now this, in my humble opinion, as we'll see in a few minutes over the rest of my talk, I don't think it's going to deal with the inflation, which then raises the question, doesn't inflation also hurt the working class? Because, especially if the working class is unable to attack inflation or deal with inflation by essentially winning compensatory wage rises, which then people point out gives rise to a wage price spiral, etc. It is going to suffer because its real wages are going to go down as a result of inflation, as Yasin has already pointed out. So having laid that out, and the reason for my not talking about greedflation, but inflation, I'm going to talk about what is it, what are the conventional views versus the, at least according to me, the correct views. I'm going to talk about money, the gold standard, and inflation. Then what can cause inflation in capitalist conditions? I completely agree with Yasin that it's the capitalist class or the capitalist mode of production that has certain definite conditions which are very different from anything else. Then we talk about what is causing inflation today, and then finally, if there is time, and I will stop my talk and wrap up within my 30 minutes. So if I don't get to say some of these things, I will say them later. So if you just want to sort of think about inflation and remember sort of the relevant salient points right now, we can certainly recall that it is particularly characteristic of the 20th century. We witnessed runaway inflation in the capitalist world in the interwar period. People remember German inflation, which, as you can see here, this lady is actually using mark notes as fuel. She's heating her home with it because they are completely worthless. And of course, some of us remember the 1970s when workers were really striking for higher wages precisely because they were suffering from inflation, much as today, with the important difference that working class strength was much greater back then than it is now. Many link the persistence of inflation to the absence of a gold standard. In the interwar period, the sterling standard had ceased operating, and in the 1970s, the dollars linked to gold had been broken. We'll come back to that, but I just want to flag that. At the end of the 1970s, the Volcker shock, and I talked about it a minute ago when looking at the federal funds rate graph, the Volcker shock is said to have tamed inflation. Volcker basically said his only and overriding priority was to tame inflation, and he didn't give a darn, he didn't give a fig about what it did to the economy. And he imposed a punishing recession, not only on the US economy, but on the world economy by extension. Since the 1980s, we have had low inflation. Now, Yasin, citing Kakedi, attributed it to the general trend of capitalist production. But if that were true, in my humble opinion, then we would never have inflation. So we have to go beyond what Kakedi says. But that's and I'm not saying that the mechanisms that Yasin talked about are wrong. They're absolutely right, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the mainstream discourse, of course, which generally takes no account of wonderful ideas, Marxist that come from Marxism, they basically have in the dominant discourse attributed low inflation to the deft management by central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve. Again, some of you will remember how Alan Greenspan was regarded by the mainstream media as the maestro who is conducting the orchestra of the US economy with nothing more than the baton, a conductor's baton, just signaling with interest rate policy and monetary policy. So that has been the dominant discourse. So the return of inflation in the post-pandemic period has been inexplicable. You know, if you have attributed the absence of inflation to the competence of the Federal Reserve, then the return of inflation must be attributed to the incompetence of the Federal Reserve. And to be sure, there are many voices in the mainstream media who basically blame Jeremy Powell for the inflation, because they say that, you know, he didn't see it coming, that when the first signs of inflation emerged, he took the sanguine view that inflation would be transitory, that we didn't need to do anything about it. And all I will say is that, quite frankly, for Powell to take that view was very convenient, because he absolutely did not want to countenance raising interest rates. He simply didn't want to do that. So now, what is the mainstream view of what causes inflation? So this is an often cited statement. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This was from the book by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz called A Monetary History of the United States. This is a cover of the book. There's Milton Friedman. And so they say it is the result of too much money, of a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than output. Moreover, in the modern era, the important next step is to recognize that today governments control the quantity of money. 10 minutes already. Oh, wow. As a result, inflation, so inflation in the United States is made in Washington, etc. So what really causes inflation? I would say that I'm going to jump through some of this, at least for now. And I would say that essentially what causes inflation is a number of things. I'm going to go straight here to this point here. Karl Polanyi is a very interesting writer. He's often opposed to Marx, but I would say that and I've written about how his thinking is very compatible with Marx. And he basically pointed out that there are three things in capitalism that are treated as commodities, but are not really commodities. And they are certainly respond very differently. They have, you know, they're not commodities in the sense that they are not produced for sale, and they are land, labor, and money. And I would say that land, land is monopolized, land is privately owned, and in our own time, land can be a source of inflation. And land is also finite. It cannot be, you know, if there is an increase in the price of land, you cannot increase the supply of land. The supply of land is finite. So that's what, essentially inflation is caused by those things whose supply capitalism relies on, but whose supply cannot be increased fast if there is a rise in prices. So land is one of them. And by the way, so are the products of the land. So typically the products of agriculture and the products of mining are not easily increased in supply. Agriculture is seasonal, mining requires long gestation periods for investment before new mines can come into operation, etc. And of course, money is an old social institution, and capitalism needs to manage money in order to both be, on the one hand, scarce enough to retain its value, and on the other hand, plentifully available in order to facilitate capitalist activity. And this leads us to a very important argument that Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik have made vis-a-vis imperialism and inflation. Imperialism has many causes and drivers, but he says one of them is one of its effects is the denial of development. Imperialism prevents other countries from developing. And it has to do that, according to them, if the value of money, of first world money, of the dollars and pounds, etc., is to be retained. Why? Because as other countries develop, they will increase the demand for commodities. If China develops, if India develops, if Africa develops, if Brazil and Latin America develop, then they will demand vastly more oil, iron ore, copper, steel, etc. And all of these commodities go into the production of practically everything we use. Of course, that will also lead to a huge demand in the price of food. So essentially, the denial of development has been critical in keeping down commodity prices and, of course, also labor prices, because, of course, as long as there is a vast hinterland from which we can import labor, when capitalists can import labor in order to keep labor markets loose, not allowing them to tighten, you essentially have a way of dealing with inflation. So in the 1970s, inflation arose because both commodity prices and labor prices rose. But in the 1980s to the 2010s, both commodity prices and labor prices were low. This is the real cause of the absence of inflation in the previous period, because essentially metropolitan capital was waging a class war against labor domestically and an international war against international war against third world countries by imposing structural adjustment, denying them development, etc., etc. And recently, this idea has been corroborated by Zoltan Pojar, who is a whiz kid who analyzed shadow banking in 2008, because he wrote a paper called War and Commodity Encumbrance, in which he basically pointed out that in today's world, the commodities are collateral for the dollar system, in the sense that they move in opposite directions. If commodity prices go up, the dollar goes down, and vice versa. So this means that commodities can get scarce in certain parts of the world, and that scarcity shows up as inflation printing far above inflation targets. So since I have relatively little time left, what I'm going to do is just talk about what is causing inflation today. So first of all, let me say that today's measures of inflation are likely understating inflation in the US, particularly because in the 1990s, there was the Boskin Commission that was appointed precisely to reduce the official count of inflation in order that US government social security payments that are indexed to inflation can be lower. So this is an important point to remember. We've already seen why the real reason inflation was low in recent decades: re-energized imperialism and capitalist power. It did emerge in the 2000s. As you will remember, there was food price inflation around 2008. Now, from 2021 onwards, as I say, initially it was thought to be transitory and later blamed for rises in food and energy prices due to the Ukraine war. But now I would say that that view is questionable. Oh, what happened there? Oh. Okay, yeah, that's better. That view is questionable because, because core inflation, I forgot to put that slide in there. So core inflation has been lower. So core inflation is about 3%. Energy inflation in October was actually negative. Food prices are still going up. So, but the core inflation remains stubbornly high, and I don't think it's going to go away. So what is really going on? I would say that the supply of food, thank you, the supply of food is constrained and therefore leading to higher prices because of decades of neoliberal destruction of agriculture, particularly in third world countries. One thing people don't recognize is that there is this ideology of how, we in first world countries are quite happy, we export grain, etc. We may export grain, but grain is not the only food we eat. And the extent of our dependence on imported food is very high, compared to, say, a country even like India, which imports a fraction of the food it consumes. Whereas in first world countries, there's a fair, you go into any supermarket and you look at how much food we import, you will see what I mean. So food prices are high, energy prices are high today because, of course, of anti-imperialist essentially stances taken by more and more suppliers of energy products. But core inflation, as I say, is high because of supply chain restrictions, which means, in effect, that the rest of the world, particularly China, is unwilling, and many parts of the third world are unable to furnish goods cheaply. And finally, the vast increase in financial activity, which I have already pointed to, is itself a cause of high inflation because of the high price of housing. So I think I will end there, and I will bring in other things as they become relevant in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, so we're going to go into the Q&A now, and we